Okay. Yeah, I'm Prof. Mike Wang from the University of Leicester. As usual, I've got far too much to say in too short a time, so I apologise if I'm going to go through this very rapidly. Hopefully there'll be time to discuss later in the day. I want to start, as Jackie just did, by re-emphasising, and I feel really obliged to do this partly because of misreporting in the press, that NAP5 is not really a measure of AAGA incidence as such. We've used the incidence a lot, but it is incidence of reporting or complaining. And we know the actual incidence. We may have some doubts about Bryce, but the actual incidence has been well established in numerous methodologically robust, large-scale international studies, and is consistently 1 in 600 operations, and particularly since 2000. And these are very large prospective cohorts. And NAP5 really doesn't touch on this particular aspect. There are lots of reasons why patients fail to report, and really I just want to show you that in this is a very complicated slide, but really it's down to the patient's motivation to actually come and speak to someone, to tell them that they've had an experience of awareness, and many simply won't do that. This is a comparative situation, adverse drug reactions. This is a systematic review of 37 studies from 12 different countries of spontaneous reporting of serious or severe adverse drug reactions. And we've got a 94 to 95% underreporting rate. Interestingly, which amounts to about 1 in 20, is very close to the difference between Bryce and NAP5 reporting. Okay. I think Sandy, who we saw in the video at the very beginning, really exemplifies many of the issues from the point of view of long-term consequences. I just want to tell you briefly about Betty, a patient of mine, former patient of mine, who came to me 35 years after her awake caesarean section with neuromuscular blockade. The key thing I want to tell you about is flashbacks. Flashbacks are really intrusive experiences. It isn't just a sort of dream or dreamlike state. The patient actually thinks they're back in the operating theatre. They smell the smells, they hear the sounds, they have the same anxiety and trauma. In this case, we've got a whole series of situations which will cue that experience. She's unable to drive because on one occasion she was driving over a flyover and saw in the distance the hospital where it happened, and she just completely lost it, hallucinated, back in the operating theatre, and her son, who was the actual product of the caesarean section, had to grab hold of the steering wheel to stop them having an accident. So that's how serious it is. I just want to pick out this one, unable to lie on her back. This is very common with AAGA patients. Because of the similarity between lying supine and drifting off to sleep and going into an anaesthetic induction, it's very common for these patients to experience panic under those circumstances, so they're just not able to sleep in a lying back position. This slide summarises the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. They come in 4 areas: high levels of autonomic arousal, so things like tachycardia, sweating, etc. Re-experiencing of the traumatic event, you've already heard me speak about flashbacks and also nightmares. Avoidance, so there's the phobic component of this experience, and cognitive and mood changes causing disengagement with everyday activity. And of course, with all of those things, you've got very much impaired quality of life. We did a study in 2004 or reported on the study in 2004, where we looked specifically at AAGA patients and their subsequent experiences. And nightmares were very common, insomnia, avoidance of hospitals, medical settings and personnel. Many of them really couldn't even go and see their GP. Loss of trust in establishment figures. I think you heard Sandy say, if you can't trust your doctor, who on earth can you trust? Relationship difficulties. Very often spouses cannot sympathise or may disbelieve that the patient has actually had this experience. They just find it so incredible. And of course, that leads to significant difficulties in relationships and then clinical depression. This slide is a summary of the care pathway that is in your report. So I'm not going to go through it in any detail because you've already got it with you. But I think the key thing is the importance of trying to listen carefully to the patient, to be empathic, rather than worrying yourself about the detail as to whether it's a real report. So it's really important from a psychological point of view to make it clear that you believe the patient's account and that you express regret. And we know that the medical defence unions have made it clear that that's not an admission of liability. So you're free to do that. And please do, because it's very important. Okay. Just some additional notes there about the situation. Blatant fabrication is rare. It's important that confusion about the particular time that they have a memory of is addressed gently, because very often you have patients confusing perioperative events or peri-anaesthetic events with actual awareness. Okay. This is a slide that summarises the main findings from NAP5. I just want to concentrate on this overrepresentation of neuromuscular blockade. So 96% of NAP5 reports, only 46% of the general activity survey of GA. And also the fact that AAGA distress strongly predicts post-operative sequelae. We know that not all patients who have AAGA go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder or other psychological disturbances. In NAP5, it was actually around 40%, but other studies have found it to be between 51 and 69%. The question then arises, what accounts for this variation? Well, there are a number of perhaps speculative, well, some of these are supported by evidence, but the one I want to focus on, and I think NAP5 strongly supports this, is it's the experience of paralysis that is key, not so much the experience of pain. Paralysis, and the paralysis, particularly if that paralysis is misinterpreted by the patient. What I'm going to do now is just illustrate how, in particular, paralysis is misinterpreted from the NAP5 reports. It's very important to remember that NAP5 was not set up to obtain detailed accounts from patients of their experiences. These are second and third hand accounts concentrating on the basic facts entered onto the online database by a local coordinator, perhaps one of you, and not the result of a psychological interview. So it has that limitation. But nevertheless, we did get some really interesting reports from patients. So here's one which I would describe as an example of catastrophic misinterpretation. Incomplete reversal. She says, I will be paralysed and unable, I thought I would be paralysed and unable to move for the rest of my life. It was a really bad experience. So it's that part of the assumption that causes all the trauma. And we know this from the general psychological understanding of what causes post-traumatic stress disorder. It's actually what psychologists call cognitive appraisal at the time that the trauma is occurring, which is key to the genesis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So what was the patient thinking at the time of the AAGA experience? Jackie's already commented on this, but this is an example of where knowing something about the nature of paralysis and the fact that neuromuscular blockade is used in an operation actually protected this particular patient. Now we move into the area of death and dying, which is something that's only come recently to my understanding of this area. We've had a number of reports in NAP5 of patients who actually thought they were dead or dying during the AAGA experience. I thought I was dying. I don't remember feeling any pain, just very scared. A patient reported auditory and tactile recall of laryngoscopy, so intubation, start of surgery. She's since had nightmares, crying in a cold sweat, recalling the patient described feeling imprisoned in their own body. Imprisoned in their own body. I'm going to come back to that idea in a minute. This one, being alive only in the head. The patient thought she was dead with just her brain and ears still working. It felt like being in a crypt. These are very stark images. This patient said that in the recovery room, the patient reported she had not felt any pain, but explained that she had felt dead intraoperatively. So, in summary, we've got accounts of fear of death, thinking that you're dying, thinking that you are actually dead during the operation, and we've got accounts of dyspnea, breathing difficulty, which is no surprise there. I want to remind you that we already know from a number of surveys that one of the most common concern of preoperative patients is the possibility of not waking up, in other words, dying during the operation, followed by fear about waking during the operation. This is just to show you that these are a whole series of retrospective surveys and studies where they've actually got into quite some detail of the symptomatology. But I want you to note that many of these patients suffer nightmares. And it's very interesting that when you look at the content of those nightmares, they are often about death and being buried alive. It's very striking. So this idea that you are in the coffin or just buried in the ground, and one can see the correspondence between the experience of awake paralysis, eyes closed, everything's dark, you can hear things, but you cannot move your body at all, how that might correspond to being buried alive. And the way the brain expresses this fear is through a nightmare of being buried alive. What's really fascinating is the fact that Claude Bernard, the French physiologist, actually had recognized this when he was doing his own experiments with curare, the concept of being fully alive but entombed in a corpse. So this has actually caused me to actually look at the children's literature on fears of death. And the fact is that a number of surveys have shown that fears of death predominate between the ages of 7 through to adolescence, and that young children tend to conceptualize death as an altered state of living, either in heaven or underground in the tomb. Immature conceptualization of death leads to questions like, why do some people I love decide to go and live underground instead? Will he or she come back soon? Isn't it cold down there? So why am I talking about those studies? Well, I think that the possibility of dying during the operation passes through most surgical patients' minds preoperatively. NAP5 demonstrates that awake paralysis is the key traumatic feature of AAGA, but the experience of awake paralysis may provoke the re-emergence of primitive childhood fears of death as a disembodied consciousness. Cultural accounts of death, as seen in the West, may be an important factor in determining cognitive appraisal of awake paralysis and, in turn, the nature and degree of psychological trauma. This was brought home to me recently because I was in Japan giving talks about anaesthetic awareness, and I discovered that almost 100% of Japanese people are incinerated at the point of death, after death, and and more than that, the whole family, including the young children, take part in a ceremony in which they observe the dead body, they see it going into the oven, they see the ashes come back in 20 minutes, and then they have this ritual where they take giant chopsticks and pick out the bones. Right? So every child in Japan knows that there's nobody living underground. There are no graveyards where there are dead bodies. So compare that with us in the West and our concepts of death, dying, and what happens to people. So I just want to pick out finally some some of the NAP5 recommendations that I think are key, and Jackie's already included some that I would fully support too. Where possible, muscle relaxants should be avoided. Please, please, if you can avoid using them, don't use them. If muscle relaxants are essential, anaesthetists should provide patient information on their effects. Do you do that? If muscle relaxants are essential, anaesthetists should consider methods of depth of anaesthesia monitoring in addition to so-called clinical signs. I know you're all taught that clinical signs are a reliable way of monitoring awareness. They are not. Okay. Thank you.